Друге питання, яке ми хочемо задати, перед тим, як задати його ще одному шановному панелісту, пану Івану Міклошу. Що Україна повинна зробити, щоб використати цей шанс розкрити свій потенціал?
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I understand Ukrainian, but unfortunately I don't speak Ukrainian, not yet. And I don't want to speak Russian, which means I will speak English. I'm very happy that I'm here. It is for the first time being in Lviv. I heard a lot about Lviv, which means I was really looking forward for this, and I have to confirm that I can confirm that Lviv is really, really beautiful. And thank you for coming. What is the most important to do? Firstly, I very agree that what was done from Maidan until now is really unprecedented. It's really big achievement. Usually I'm saying that it was done much more during these 2 years from Maidan, more than 2 years, than 20 plus years before. This is clear. What is the problem or challenge is, and what is the question mark, is about speed of this development and even more about sustainability of this development. Of course, we can argue that it was possible to do much more. Yes, that's true. But it was done really, really a lot. I think for the first time it was really change which we can define as systemic change. And the biggest achievement, in my opinion, and the biggest precondition for this is that there is really strong will among people, among ordinary people, for integration and for reforms. But now, what for the future? What is, as I said, the biggest threat, biggest question mark is about speed, but even the mostly I'm aware about sustainability of the reform process. What are the biggest threat for this future, for sustainability of the successful reform process? I think there are 3 biggest threats for this. First one is corruption. Second one is Putin's Russia. And third one is populism. And this is, I think, and I would like stress especially this third one. All these threats are interconnected. If we are speaking about populism, for instance, populism is the biggest obstacle for the fighting against corruption. If you are speaking about Russia, it is clear that Russia, in many methods, is supporting populist politicians, populist movements, and everything connected with this. Which means where I see the biggest problem is the lack of leadership, ownership, and communication of reforms, because this is important precondition to continue in the successful reform progress. Leaders who are really convinced about necessity of reforms and are fighting for reforms. Ownership, as Timothy has mentioned also, it is nice to have advisors from countries who did some reforms, but reforms have to be done by you, by Ukrainians, by Ukrainian leaders, Ukrainian politicians. And what is even more important, Ukraine's reforms have to be done not because pressure and demand from outside, not because IMF is needed, not because European Union, but because Ukrainian people need these reforms. And third, communication. Communication is one of the most important preconditions for continuing reforms, because what is the problem? The problem is that people in general support reforms. They want reforms, but but they don't understand if specific reform measures are coming. They don't understand these relations between reform measures and effect for the future. For instance, to give you example, almost everybody is against corruption, but it is not sufficient understanding that, for instance, energy tariffs deregulation are one of the most effective methods on the fighting against corruption. And it is necessary to communicate this, because if not, then populists are communicating very effectively and very, very intensively. Which means, from this point of view, I see very hopeful changes or preconditions. I think there is ownership, there is will of the politicians to do reforms, but still it will be very important to fight for reforms. Because how Leszek Balcerowicz, my colleague in our strategic advisory group, said, he said it. He wrote a book about his life as a reformer, and the title of this book is, it was translated also in Russian, and title is "Nado boroться." We have to fight for reforms. It is necessary to fight. It is necessary to fight because only then results will come. And in my opinion, practical opinion, how we did reforms, the most effective methods for the fighting against corruption, for instance, for the speeding up reforms, for the opening country, opening competition, have been liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. It means it was also the most effective methods for the fighting against corruption. And it is clear that if Ukraine will continue in this direction, then the reforms will bring also positive results, and Ukraine will be a successful country. Because I have to say that I don't know any other country which is still such below in comparison with potential of the country. Ukraine has huge potential, and to use this potential, it will be necessary to continue in reform process.
Let us see the result of the vote, and then I'll ask you one more question, because I have a special question to clarify your position probably. So the vote is clear. It's optimistic, I think, from my point of view. So you mentioned 3 points, like corruption, geopolitical issues, Russia, and populism. We've already talked about, it's clear that corruption, people understand and they want to fight it. We already talked a little bit about geopolitics with Tim, and probably we'll continue to do it in discussion. My specific question is about the third one, which I think is, in my personal opinion, is probably the most important and undervalued thing, populism. So my question is the following. You probably more than everybody here, because you're an experienced politician, know that most politicians in the world use populism, because politics is a very cynical thing, and without populism you just don't win your elections. And you know, famous example of British, once again, let me remind British history, when the winner of World War II, Winston Churchill, just lost elections after the war because Clement Attlee was promising them something like, you know, golden things, a recovery and many things, and they just chosen that, although there was a real winner. So sometimes people like to listen to populists. So what do you think? Is it a vicious circle, or how would you, or probably other speakers, if you want to join us, want to break this vicious circle? Because when you're not using populism, people don't vote for yourself. If you do use populism, you need to fulfill your agreements, and then you see in Brexit case how Cameron, what was the consequence when Cameron decided to fulfill his promises to make this referendum?
The key question, and the most important question, not only in Ukraine, everywhere. If you look at the Europe today, this is the lack of leadership, lack of leaders who are not afraid, or who are not, I mean, moved only by popularity, by actual popularity. Let me tell you 2 quotations. First one is from Jean-Claude Juncker, who said this. When I was finance minister, we discussed about Lisbon strategy, how to increase competitiveness of Europe, and he said, we all, of course, know what is necessary to do. What we don't know is how to win elections after doing this. But I will offer you also, because I don't think that Juncker was right in this, and I will offer you also another quotation. This, I think Benjamin Disraeli said it, and he said, what is the difference between statesman and politician? He said, while politician cares about next elections, statesman cares about next generations. And this is about the lack of leaders, which means the lack of statesmen. People who are doing necessary changes despite of political risk connected with this. If I'm speaking about leadership, ownership, and communication, I'm speaking about this. And this is not true. Now, why I think Jean-Claude Juncker was not correct, of course, it is big risk connected with this. But we have a lot of practical examples that leaders who did kind of reforms succeeded also politically. What is the most important in this is that reforms have to be done as quickly as possible and as more complexly as possible, because then you can expect that if you have 4 years term, not only costs of the reforms will come, but also positive results of the restructured economy, economic growth, and so on and so on. And we have examples in Baltic countries, for instance. Dombrovskis did in Latvia in 2008, 2009, really very severe, even the radical reforms. He was re-elected as prime minister after doing this. Also in Slovakia, after we did all these reforms, we lost power, but a result of our party, Zurinda's party, after doing this reforms, and we were the most reformed party, was the best in history, in our history. Which means it is risk, it is really big risk, serious risk, but that's why it is difficult, but there's no other way. Which means, in my opinion, the lack of leadership is the biggest precondition for successful changes and successful reforms.